In the quiet midwinter of a restless century, a boy was born beneath the soft gray skies of Chicago. The snow was falling slowly that year, and the streets carried the hush of horse hooves and chimneys. James Thomas Mangan entered the world in 1896 with lungs full of cold air and a heart already full of dreams. He was not born into a palace, not into wealth, not even into comfort. He was born like many others in a city that smoked and roared, but something in him moved more quietly, like a low wind through distant stars. As a child, he watched the trains, watched the ships, read the newspapers his father left behind. But when night came, he didn't look to the factories or railroads. He looked up out of the window of his small room, fogged by winter breath. He looked at the sky, not for weather, not for airplanes, but for something older, quieter. He watched the stars and wondered, not what they were made of, but what they meant. James was not a scientist. He never wore goggles, never worked in a lab. He did not break atoms or launch rockets, but he asked questions that felt just as large and sometimes even larger. He asked, who owns the stars? Who do they belong to, really? And what if they belong to all of us, or none of us at all? He didn't shout these thoughts. He didn't scribble them angrily in margins. He held them softly, like glass marbles in his palms. And night after night he looked to the sky, not as a boy looking for answers, but as someone already learning how to listen. He grew slowly, carefully. He worked jobs like everyone else, sometimes in publishing, sometimes in public relations, sometimes just selling ideas with little more than paper and charm. But beneath the surface, something vast was forming. He wrote in private, filled notebooks with strange reflections on the mind, on the world, on thought itself. He became fascinated by inner power, the quiet kind, not the kind that controls, but the kind that clarifies. He believed in mental frequencies, in the soft force of affirmations, in the echo that words leave inside us. He wrote things like, "You are what you think. Peace begins in the breath." The universe starts within. Chicago moved around him fast, busy horns and boots and sirens. But James walked slowly, as if each step was its own meditation. His eyes did not scan buildings, they followed birds, clouds, the hush between moments. He was not well known, not a name in lights, but he had a kind of light in him, and he spent it slowly, deliberately, on thoughts that stretched beyond the earth. When he spoke, it was softly. When he taught, it was gently. When he dreamed, it was completely. James saw the world and then he saw past it. He began to think of space not as silence, but as sanctuary, not as darkness, but as belonging, not as a place to conquer, but as a home to protect. And that thought, like a slow flame, took hold of him. He thought, if no one owns the stars, and everyone wants to, then maybe someone should stand for no one and for everyone. He thought, maybe there should be a nation, not of borders and bullets, but of vision of peace, of shared sky. He would go for walks, long walks beneath the city skyline, and imagine treaties not yet signed, flags not yet raised, a world not yet ready for what he was already beginning to write. At night, he returned to his desk, lit by one gentle lamp, and scribbled ideas that didn't yet have a place, a new kind of place, a nation of the cosmos, without war, without walls, without need to fight. He imagined children being born under that idea, growing up, not to claim land, but to honor the space around them as something shared and infinite. James didn't need permission. He didn't wait for approval. He didn't need an audience. What he needed was the sky, and it was already there. He began to speak of something called Celestia, the nation of celestial space, a place not limited by geography but defined by imagination. He wasn't trying to be absurd. He wasn't being ironic. He believed truly that declaring a peaceful nation in space was more than a gesture. It was a kind of offering to the world, to the stars, to the future. He lived in a modest home, with modest furniture and modest means. But his mind stretched farther than nations dared not, with missiles but with meaning. People would sometimes ask him why he did the things he did, and he would smile and say something simple like, because someone has to do it first, or because the stars are watching, too. He wasn't building monuments. He was building metaphors. He was crafting reminders that not all nations need soil, that sometimes a declaration can be made to the universe, not to control it, but to care for it. James Thomas Mangan lived quietly, but he thought boldly. And long before he printed a passport or raised a flag, he had already done the hardest thing he believed. And he stayed with that belief, even when no one else joined him. That was his strength, not stubbornness, but serenity, not ego, but stillness. He didn't just see space. He felt it as something sacred, as something that asked to be protected and shared. And so he prepared himself, not with armor, but with clarity, not with power, but with presence. Because even in a city filled with voices, sometimes all it takes is one man speaking softly for the stars to listen back. James Thomas Mangan was not a man of armies. He held no territory. He commanded no borders. But he had something stronger than all of those things. He had conviction in a clear sky. By the late 1940s, the world had seen 2 wars, 2 great shadows pass over the land, and the idea of peace, true peace, had begun to feel like a ghost, a memory, a wish whispered in sleep. But James had not forgotten. He carried peace with him, not as an argument, but as a presence. He watched the new headlines of space rockets in the air, military minds aiming for the stars. The Cold War was rising, and the sky was no longer a mystery, but a race. He felt a weight in his chest, a quiet ache as he saw the heavens being divided not by wonder, but by flags. To James, this was not progress. This was a warning. And so on a winter's day in 1949, he sat at his desk and did something no government had done, no army had prepared for. He claimed the entire universe not for himself, but for everyone. He called it the nation of celestial space, a name both elegant and enormous, a name that reached beyond nations, beyond Earth itself. He shortened it to Celestia, soft on the tongue, strong in meaning, and he wrote it down not in poetry, but in paperwork. On January 20th, he filed the official documents with the county of Cook in Illinois, the same place you'd register a marriage or a land deed. That's where James registered the universe. He did it legally, calmly, properly, no ceremony, no television, just ink and paper and belief. He stated that Celestia claimed all of outer space, everything beyond Earth's atmosphere, all of it, the planets, the moons, the comets, the black velvet sky. It was not a threat, not a conquest. It was a declaration of stewardship. Where others saw a void, James saw a responsibility. If no one else would step forward to speak for the stars, he would not to rule them, but to guard them. He believed that space must belong to. No nation must remain peaceful, must be preserved for the good of all humankind. The claim was clear, but it was not selfish. He wasn't building a throne in the sky. He was setting a table for everyone. And in doing so, he gave birth to something rare, a nation without land, a nation without soldiers, a nation without fear. Celestia had no need for boundaries, no need for weapons, no anthem, no walls, but it had a founder, it had a vision, and now it had a name. James began writing letters, not just to his friends, but to governments, to the United Nations, to embassies around the world. He informed them that Celestia now existed, that it had legal standing, that it had a claim to space, and that it was open to peaceful cooperation. He asked for recognition, not in arrogance, but in clarity, because he knew that before space could be divided, someone had to speak on behalf of unity. And while most governments ignored him, some didn't. Some replied curious, bemused, but not dismissive, because there was something sincere in what James was doing, something quiet but hard to deny. He was not trying to gain power. He was trying to prevent its misuse, to keep the stars from becoming another battlefield. He created a flag for Celestia, a simple design with a starburst at its heart, radiating out like a quiet sun. He carried it with him, folded in his coat, as one might carry a prayer. And one day he stood in front of the United Nations building in New York, on the cold sidewalk beneath the flags of the world, and he raised his own, not with noise, not with protest. He raised it gently, as if placing it on the wind itself. No one stopped him, no one pulled it down. It fluttered for a moment, just long enough to be seen, to be remembered to exist. And in that moment, Celestia became more than an idea, more than a document. It became visible. James printed passports, real ones with covers and stamps. He created currency with imaginary values, backed by infinite space. He did not do this to fool anyone. He did it to make the idea real in every way he could, because he understood something that many powerful men forget, that reality begins in belief, that form follows thought, that if you treat something with respect, others might begin to do the same. So he treated Celestia with dignity, as if it were already ancient, already sacred. He appointed ministers, he held discussions, he wrote speeches, and he dreamed policies, all for a nation that floated above every map, a nation drawn only in the imagination, and yet it was real to him, as real as anything on earth, because it stood for something he felt the world was forgetting, that we are not meant to own everything we see, that we are not made to divide all that is empty, that some places should remain shared and silent and safe. Celestia was that place. Celestia was not made of land. It had no soil, no borders, no coastline to walk barefoot along. And yet James Thomas Mangan moved through the world as if he were already a citizen of that invisible nation. He wore no uniform, no crown, no badge, but he carried with him a quiet certainty, a softness of purpose, and an unwavering clarity that gave him the presence of a founder. He spoke of Celestia not as a dream, but as a fact, an entity, a sovereign reality. And slowly he began to act accordingly. He designed a national flag, a white starburst against a deep blue field, radiating outward, simple, gentle, meant not to dominate but to invite. He had copies sewn by hand and folded them with care as if folding something sacred. Each crease deliberate, each color a declaration of peace. He made stamped small works of art, each one bearing the name of Celestia, each one a whisper sent across envelopes to distant corners of earth. He printed passports, not for travel, but for belonging, for those who believed, as he did, that space must remain free. The pages were real, the bindings were clean, the words were warm, and the seals were pressed with purpose. He minted coins, not to spend, but to symbolize tiny, silver and gold, discs, emblems of a value that could not be measured in dollars. He even began drafting laws, writings on celestial ethics, on peaceful exploration, on shared stewardship of the stars. He wrote them at night, by the window, while the city slept below, and the sky stretched above, silent and watching. He appointed ministers, named officials, created departments, foreign affairs, science, and thought, art, and harmony. Each role chosen not for power, but for poetry, not for structure, but for soul. His daughter, Retha Mangan, he named Minister of Foreign Affairs. She accepted the role with the same quiet grace as her father had invented it. Together they began to send letters, diplomatic messages to actual embassies, to real-world leaders, not as satire, not as provocation, but as sincere offerings from one nation to another. They signed documents with the Celestian seal. They spoke of cooperation, of neutrality, of shared futures above the earth. Some laughed, some ignored, but some replied, not many, but a few curious diplomats, thoughtful secretaries, perhaps even a lonely translator or two who felt the strange honesty woven into every page. And so Celestia, though not recognized, was acknowledged, not formally but spiritually. It had no army, but it had language. It had no power, but it had presence. And slowly it began to be seen. Newspapers caught wind of the idea, and headlines appeared across Chicago. Then New York, then London, and Paris. Man claims outer space for peace. Chicago publicist declares himself first celestial citizen. New nation has no land, but all the sky. Reporters came to ask questions, and James answered, everyone with calm, with patience, with kindness. He was never flustered, never defensive. He simply explained that Celestia existed because it had to, because the alternative was to let the sky become another battleground. He did not attack governments. He did not protest war. He simply offered a different path, and that path was quiet and blue and infinite. He brought Celestian flags to events, to meetings. He held them like candles, soft lights in hard rooms. Sometimes people smiled amused, sometimes they rolled their eyes, but sometimes they nodded, because somewhere deep beneath their suits and schedules they too, at once, looked at the stars and wondered. James printed leaflets, crafted emblems, created postage, and wrote long essays on celestial sovereignty, on ethical expansion, on space. As sanctuary, he mailed them across the world, sometimes by post, sometimes by hand, to thinkers, to dreamers, to those who might listen, and some did. He was invited to speak on radio shows, at universities, on quiet panels, tucked away in libraries, not often but enough. And every time he spoke gently, softly, with the voice of someone who wasn't trying to convince but simply trying to share. His tone was never urgent, never loud. He believed that ideas worth holding do not need to shout. He wore suits that were simple but neat, his hair combed carefully, his papers in order. He looked like a man who had come to read a story, and in a way that's exactly what he had come to do. To tell a story of what space could be if we imagined it not as frontier, but as common ground. To remind the world that not everything had to be owned, that some things could simply be respected and protected. And through all of it, he never lost his warmth. He would smile during interviews, pause before answering, and always thank the person asking as if they had offered him a gift, because to him every question was a chance to speak on behalf of the stars. Celestia was no longer just an idea. It had become a gesture, a living metaphor, a kind of slow-spoken protest, not against governments, but against forgetting. Against forgetting our shared sky, against forgetting our shared future, against forgetting our better selves. And James, he became its vessel, its voice, its heartbeat, not because anyone elected him, but because he had stepped forward when no one else had. He carried Celestia in his briefcase, in his coat pocket, in his words and in his silence. He knew it might never be recognized, never be accepted, never be signed into history, but that wasn't the point. The point was to offer it anyway, to give shape to something we need before we know we need it, to name peace before war can claim the stars. And so he kept walking through cities, through offices, through time itself, like a quiet envoy from a nation made not of soil, but of soul. Celestia never built a city, never paved a road, never drew a border across the land, but it grew, not in the soil, but in the mind, not through conquest, but through quiet presence. James Thomas Mangan walked the earth as if he were walking through something sacred, as if every step was taken on behalf of a nation that floated above all others. His movements were slow but assured. He did not need validation to know what was real to him. Celestia became his language, his rhythm, his lens. Through it, he saw the future, not as something to be taken, but something to be honored, held, and offered. He continued to send letters, sometimes answered, sometimes discarded, but that never stopped him. Celestia was not dependent on recognition. It was not diminished by silence. It did not vanish when ignored. It simply remained. James began referring to himself, not as an activist, not as an eccentric, but as a Celestian. He lived as one, thought as one, and in doing so, Celestia began to take shape not in geography, but in identity. It became a place one could belong to, not by location, but by intention. He carried its passport in his coat, kept the flag near his desk, read from its foundational texts, not because anyone demanded it, but because belief requires repetition. He wrote manifestos on celestial cooperation, on peace beyond the stratosphere, on planetary diplomacy and cosmic trust. They were not fantasies, they were blueprints for a reality that had not yet come, but might one day arrive. He knew the world thought him strange, a footnote, a curiosity. He was mentioned in columns, quirky news, pieces lists of odd claims and bold declarations, but he read them without anger, sometimes even with a soft smile, because what they saw as absurd, he saw as essential. In a world that often mocked gentleness, he doubled down on it. He did not argue. He invited. He did not demand. He described. He spoke at schools and libraries, sometimes in living rooms with only a handful of listeners. But to James, each listener mattered, because Celestia had never been about the masses. It had always been about the idea, one soul at a time, one mind opened, one heart softened. He believed deeply that a single shift in perspective was enough to alter the future, that if even one child grew up believing that space was sacred, that peace was possible, that shared sky meant shared destiny, then Celestia had already succeeded. So he kept going decade after decade, while the world raced toward space with rockets and satellites, while governments drew invisible lines across the stars. James simply stood still and held up a flag no one asked for. He never tried to stop the world. He tried to remind it of something it already knew, but had forgotten, that the stars are not empty. They're full of meaning, full of silence, full of invitation. Celestia became a ritual for him, a living meditation, a symbol that required living through it, not just talking about it. He developed a rhythm, a life aligned with his nation, his creation. Each morning he would sit by the window and look up as if reporting in, checking on his territory, though it was not his to control. It was his to care for. He reviewed correspondence, sent mail, updated Celestian records with careful handwriting, each entry a small ceremony, each document a quiet affirmation. He did not tire, not in spirit, even as his body aged, even as the world changed. He watched from his small home as the space race unfolded, as men walked on the moon, as satellites multiplied, and nations extended their reach beyond gravity. He watched it all with calm eyes, with hope, and with caution, because for all the wonder, he also saw the risk that space might become just another mirror of Earth's mistakes. He hoped still that someone somewhere would raise a Celestian flag, not for ownership, but for memory, not to claim, but to remember what it meant to imagine, because that's what Celestia was at its core, not a claim, but a memory in advance, a memory of what could be. He kept journals full of reflections, of small moments and large questions. He wondered often what future generations might think. Would they laugh? Would they understand? Would they carry forward even a single part of the dream? He didn't know, and he was at peace with that, because Celestia was never meant to be measured in achievements. It was meant to be measured in stillness, in resonance, in kindness. He met people along the way, some curious, some skeptical, some quietly moved. A child once asked him, "Do you live on another planet?" And he'd smiled and said, "No, I live here, but my heart lives above." Another time, a woman approached him after a small talk and said, "I don't think I believe in Celestia, but I wish I did." To which he replied, "That's enough. Wishing is the first passport." Because to James, Celestia wasn't about belief in him. It was about belief in something larger, gentler, shared. He never grew tired of explaining it, not even when he had explained it 1,000 times. Because each time, he was also reminding himself that it mattered, that it still mattered. Even in old age, he remained devoted. His desk remained the same, papers stacked neatly, pens in a jar, a flag folded nearby, stamps in drawers, passports in a box, ready waiting, not for use, but for meaning. He once wrote, "If the stars are free, then so must we be. And if we are to be free, then we must first imagine what freedom looks like beyond the sky." And that was Celestia. It was not a nation like others. It was a sanctuary of thought, a place where peace was policy and poetry was law, a place where one man's quiet dream became a mirror for humanity, not in conquest, but in care. And as the years passed, as buildings rose higher, as machines flew faster, as maps grew more crowded, Celestia remained unmoved, unchanging, unforgotten, because it had never truly been in space. It had always been in us. James Thomas Mangan did not look at space and see a place to go. He looked at space and saw a place to protect. He did not see territory. He saw inheritance, not something to take, but something to be trusted with. This belief, this quiet certainty was at the core of everything he did. Celestia was not a stunt, not a satire, not a strange detour in a strange man's life. It was the natural expression of his deepest values. To him, space was not an emptiness, it was a mirror so vast that it could only reflect what we choose to place in front of it. He feared that if we looked into the stars with hunger, with greed, with ambition, without humility, then the stars would return that same gaze back to us. So instead, he tried to look with care, with calm, with kindness, because space wasn't just where we were going, it was what we were becoming. He believed that how we approach the unknown defines who we are in the known. And so he made Celestia as a kind of offering, not to control, but to ask, not to take, but to think. He often wrote that thought precedes reality, that the universe first forms in the mind, and only then in matter. So if we imagined peace spoke, peace acted in peace, perhaps peace would echo back, not only on earth, but above it. James believed in frequency, not just as vibration, but as alignment. He believed that thoughts had their own weight, their own direction, and that intention was the first tool of creation. Before buildings, before rockets, before laws, there is thought, and where thought goes, reality follows. He believed that we are all transmitters, each of us sending signals into the space around us, and that these signals of fear or of love shape not only our future, but the shape of what welcomes us beyond this world. To him, this was not metaphysics. It was a kind of gentle engineering of the self, of society, of the stars. He called it perfect living and wrote of it often, not as a system of control, but as a practice of resonance. He believed that our words tune our minds, and our minds tune the universe. He often sat in silence before writing anything, not to think harder, but to think softer, to let the noise drain out and let the signal rise. Then he would begin short sentences, simple affirmations, ideas repeated gently until they felt like breath. He believed in affirmations not for ego, but for clarity. He believed that to say, "I am peaceful," was not to boast, but to listen, to become aware of what peace sounds like inside the self. He filled journals with quiet phrases, whispers into the mind, words like, "All space is sacred, peace is presence, nothing belongs, everything is shared. The stars are not above us, they are within us." These weren't mantras to control the world. They were reminders to not lose ourselves as the world grew louder. He believed that naming something was the first act of responsibility. And so by naming space, not as territory but as trust, he hoped to change how others saw it too. Celestia was that name. The name he gave to a space that should remain free. And by naming it, he believed he gave it protection. Because what is named can be remembered, and what is remembered can be respected. He saw naming as sacred, a quiet form of guarding, of holding, of keeping safe. Celestia was not his, it was ours. That was his point all along. He never used the phrase, "I own." He always wrote, "I claim for all humanity. I protect in the name of peace. I declare so that others may follow." There was no me at the center, only the hope that we might mean something more than just many me. He believed that the future needs caretakers, not conquerors, and that the stars deserve our gentlest selves. Celestia was not his crown. It was his compass, and it pointed always not upward, but inward. Because to James, space was not simply out there. It was also within us. Our capacity to hold peace, to imagine peace, to share peace, to live peace. was itself a kind of inner orbit, a celestial path that one could walk without ever leaving the earth. He believed that if a person tuned themselves to peace, they were already in motion, already part of something larger, already orbiting a quieter sun. He sometimes called this mental citizenship, the idea that you belonged not by passport but by practice, not by geography but by generosity, that by choosing peace, by thinking peace, you became a Celestian, even if you never heard the name, because Celestia was not built to be found, it was built to be remembered. James saw the world, rushing, racing, reaching outward, and he paused. He sat, he wrote, he watched, not to resist progress, but to ask what kind of progress we truly want. He asked questions that most people forgot to ask. Not how far can we go, but how gently. Not how fast can we expand, but how wisely. Not who will plant their flag, but who will sit quietly and listen to the silence between stars. He did not find these questions in books. He found them in stillness. And in that stillness, he found something rare, a kind of hope that does not burn bright, but burns long, a quiet hope, a steady light, the kind you follow when the road is unclear. That light was Celestia, and his belief, his soft philosophy, was that one day, perhaps we might all see it, not as a place to reach, but as a way to live. James Thomas Mangan believed that imagination was not a distraction, but a responsibility. He believed that the unseen was not less real, but more sacred. He believed that to imagine peace was not to escape the world, but to expand it, to widen its boundaries, to soften its edges. To him, imagination was a form of care, and care was the true work of Celestia. He did not believe that laws alone could hold the future, nor treaties nor machines. He believed that what we imagine becomes what we build, that if we imagine war, we build for war. If we imagine competition, we build borders. But if we imagine peace, if we imagine sharing, listening, waiting, welcoming, then perhaps we begin to build that too. He wrote often that thought was not neutral, that it carried weight, that it had direction, and that it left a shape wherever it went. So he made his thoughts into shapes of kindness, and then he lived inside them. He wrote of Celestia as if it had always existed, as if he had simply remembered it. He never called himself a founder. He called himself a discoverer, as if Celestia had been floating there in the silence of potential, waiting for someone to give it voice. That voice was his soft, patient, careful. He spoke not to persuade, but to protect, not to claim, but to clarify. He often said that the world suffers most when we forget to name what is good, and so he named space good. He named peace necessary. He named humanity capable of gentleness. He believed that to name something with love was to offer it protection. He believed that flags should not mark ownership, but intention, that borders should not divide, but describe responsibility, that nations should not be built on fear, but on generosity. Celestia was all of this, a nation not of soil, but of spirit. He described it as a kind of atmosphere you could breathe in if you slowed down enough, a place that surrounded us when we chose calm, chose kindness, chose awareness. He did not teach. He reminded people that they already knew how to be gentle, that they already carried peace, but often forgot where they had placed it. He said, "We live surrounded by mirrors, but rarely stop to look. And when we do, we often don't recognize the reflection because it's softer than what we've been taught to see. To live as a Celestian was to remember that reflection, to act not for reward, but for resonance, to ask not what can I take, but what can I hold with care, with silence, with meaning. He sometimes said that every choice is a kind of orbit, and that the way we move through life defines the gravity we leave behind. He chose a light gravity, a way of being that left space for others, that left room for mystery, for contradiction, for beauty. He believed in words, but not the sharp kind. He believed in soft words, slow words, repetitions that soothe. He would repeat the same phrases over and over, not for effect but for alignment. Phrases like, space is not to be owned, peace is not to be delayed, imagination is not weakness, what is shared is stronger. He wrote them, spoke them, lived them. He treated language as a kind of architecture, every word a beam, every sentence a shelter, a place for peace to live quietly, safely. He called Celestia a living poem, a nation written in air. He didn't mean that it was empty. He meant it was open, and that openness was the point. He believed that openness is what makes something sacred, not being hidden but being offered without demand, without defense. Celestia never asked for loyalty, only for attention, only for thoughtfulness, only for care. It didn't ask you to pledge, only to pause, to breathe, to notice, to wonder. James believed that wonder was not childish. It was wise, because to wonder is to remember that we don't know everything, and that not knowing is a kind of honesty. He called Celestia a place where wonder is policy, where curiosity is protected, where silence is valued, where kindness is a natural law. He didn't believe in utopia. He believed in practice, in daily acts, in consistent gestures, in small rituals of thought and language that shape the way we see and the way we move. He believed that a better world would not arrive suddenly, but would be grown gently from the inside out. He believed that the world we build begins with the world we carry inside. So he worked not to change governments, but to tend gardens of thought, to keep the soil of imagination fertile, so that when the time came, new seeds could grow. He saw himself not as a leader, but as a gardener, planting, waiting, watering gently even when the clouds refused to come. Celestia was his garden and his prayer. It was his response to a world that had learned to shout. He responded by whispering, and in that whisper he made a space not just above us, but within us. He never shouted, never demanded, never declared victory. He simply kept offering an idea, a soft place, a sky without borders. And even when the world moved on, when newspapers stopped asking, when diplomats stopped replying, James kept living Celestia, because he had never done it for approval. He had done it because something in him refused to give up on what could be shared without being broken. He once wrote, "Peace is not a prize, it is a presence, and it begins wherever someone remembers that it still matters." James remembered, and through him so did Celestia. It was never just about space. It was about everything we touch that could be touched more gently, everything we claim that could be shared, everything we fear that could be listened to. Instead, Celestia was and still is an invitation to imagine differently, to name carefully, to live more slowly, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps in a world of rush and noise, a single man walking quietly beneath an imagined flag is the most radical act of all. James Thomas Mangan did not simply speak of Celestia. He lived it, every day with quiet consistency. He shaped his life around the idea he had planted, not as a fantasy, but but as a practice. He was not playing a role, not performing, not pretending. He was being as one becomes when the inner truth aligns fully with the outer world. His home, though modest, became a kind of embassy. The walls were lined with papers, documents of Celestia, flags carefully folded, files labeled by hand, a desk that bore the rhythm of ritual. It was not clutter, it was ceremony. Each drawer held stamps, each shelf held proclamations, each object touched often and gently. He kept the Celestian flag nearby, sometimes draped over a chair, sometimes pinned discreetly by the window, not to be admired, but to remind he did not decorate his space. He consecrated it, because to him Celestia was not an escape from Earth. It was a way of being on Earth. He treated even the smallest acts, signing a letter, placing a stamp, folding a passport, as if they were sacred rituals of belonging not to a country, but to a cause, and not a cause of protest, but of presence. He made things not to convince others, but to affirm for himself that the idea lived, and through that living, maybe others would feel it too. His mornings began with reading, not the news, but old notes, passages he had written months or years before, little meditations on peace, on purpose, on the quiet courage of believing in something no one else sees. Then he would write new entries, not to say something new, but to stay in rhythm, to keep the song going. Celestia, after all, was not a message to deliver. It was a song to sustain. He wrote letters, hundreds over the years, to ambassadors, to agencies, to curious strangers, each one crafted with care, each line gentle, each word placed with purpose. He would reread them, not to edit, but to re-enter the feeling that shaped them. He sealed them by hand, pressed his small Celestian seal into the wax, a sunburst in miniature, then sent them out into a world that mostly did not answer. But that didn't matter. To James, the gesture was the message. The act of sending was already a kind of recognition, because Celestia could not be ignored if it kept showing up with kindness again and again. He printed currency coins that bore the Celestian emblem, not to spend, but to share gifts to those who asked or who simply wondered, little objects that sparked a smile, a question, or a moment of pause. He would place them in envelopes accompanied by small notes, folded neatly, handwritten, "Welcome, citizen," or "The sky belongs to all of us," not demands, not declarations, just offerings. A reminder that symbols, when used with care, can open doors inside people. He printed passports too, each one by hand, each name entered with a kind of reverence. He never asked for money, only sincerity. If someone wanted to belong, to believe, to carry even a sliver of the Celestian dream, they were welcome. The passport was never a transaction. It was a reflection of intention, of imagination, of a silent alignment with a softer future. Sometimes he would meet people who were confused, even suspicious. Why do this? What's the point? Is it real? And he would smile, not to dismiss, but to soften and say, "It's as real as the peace you choose." Because for James, the question was never whether Celestia existed. The question was whether we were ready to live as if it did. He was often alone, but never lost, because his solitude was not emptiness, it was clarity. He was not isolated, he was anchored in a vision that did not need crowds, or applause, or even success, only faithfulness, and that he once raised the Celestian flag in front of the United Nations building without announcement, without ceremony. He walked, unfolded it, and let it rise in the wind beside the flags of Earth's nations. No one stopped him. No one questioned him. The guards watched, then looked away. It flew briefly, but long enough to be real. Not because of how high it flew, but because of the quiet courage that lifted him. That act became a legend, but James never spoke of it with pride, only with calm. It needed to be done, he said once, and so I did it. He did not seek headlines, though they came. He did not crave interviews, though they arrived. He answered gently, spoke simply, always returning the conversation to what mattered most. Not him, but the stars. Not the claim, but the care. He saw Celestia not as his invention, but as a truth that had been waiting for someone to live it. And so he did, even when others forgot, even when the world moved faster, louder, brighter. He stayed slow and quiet. And true, his friends sometimes called him eccentric, but they also called him kind, consistent, gentle. Because even if they did not fully understand Celestia, they understood James. And that was enough, because he never tried to impose his vision, only to embody it, to become in his own life the very peace he hoped to see in the stars. He wore his belief like a second skin, soft, worn, comforting, and it showed in the way he listened, in the way he moved through rooms, in the way he never rushed, never raised his voice, never closed the door. His life was a long invitation to consider, to wonder, to remember that a symbol lived with care can become more than itself. It can become a kind of gravity, pulling others gently into a new way of being. And that was Celestia, not a place to go, but a way to move, not a country to visit, but a space to carry, not a flag to salute, but a rhythm to return to. Again and again, James returned to it, every day, with every gesture, with every word, with every moment of faithful quiet. James Thomas Mangan did not slow down with age, not in the ways that mattered. His steps grew slower, his hair grew thin, his handwriting more deliberate, but his purpose, his rhythm, his clarity remained steady. He didn't look for rest, because his life already was rest. A calm pace, a still purpose, a peaceful orbit around one enduring idea, Celestia. Each morning he sat at his desk, the same desk worn smooth at the corners, gently stained by time and ink. He would look out the window at the same Chicago street, watching people pass cars, roll leaves, shift with the wind, and then he would begin again. A small act, a quiet ritual, a letter, a stamp, a gentle correction in an old record. Some days he opened envelopes with real replies from distant places. A teacher in Sweden, a student in India, a poet in Montreal, all of them touched in some soft way by what he had sent into the world. Sometimes they didn't quite understand what Celestia was, but they felt something beneath the idea, something warm, something careful, something oddly comforting. One wrote, "I don't think your nation exists, but I believe it." Another said, "I read your letter out loud to my children. They asked if the stars had presidents now." James would smile at that, not with amusement, but with hope, because if a child asked that question, then something had been planted, and planting had always been the point. He was not trying to harvest belief. He was planting a possibility. Again and again, year after year, he would reread the old declaration, sometimes aloud, sometimes only in his mind. They didn't change, and that was their strength. In a world that shifted, chased, reshaped itself every season, Celestia remained still, a constant rhythm of intention and care. He added new passages, sometimes, but gently, as one adds notes to a melody already complete. He treated Celestia not as an institution, but as a spirit, not to be governed, but to be honored. Even his meals, his walks, his conversations were colored by the presence of that invisible nation. He once stopped at a bakery and gave the clerk a coin, a Celestian coin, silver simple bright in the light. The clerk looked at it confused. "This isn't real," he said. James replied softly, "It is, if you treat it kindly." The man didn't argue. He just placed it in a small dish beside the register, where it stayed for years. Sometimes people would ask about it, and he'd say, "A man gave me that. He said it belonged to the stars." Not everyone needs to believe or something to endure. Sometimes it's enough to be remembered. James walked through his neighborhood, known by few, understood by fewer, but respected not for power, not for success, but for gentleness. He was consistent, and consistency can become sacred when paired with sincerity. People saw in him something peaceful, even if they didn't know why. A man who moved slowly, who always listened, who never interrupted, who never hurried anyone. A man who wrote by hand, who folded letters with care, who looked up every time he stepped outside as if checking on the sky. And in truth, he was not to measure it, not to claim it, but to remember it, to remind himself of what he had chosen to protect. In his later years, he received fewer replies, fewer interviews, fewer requests, but he did not grieve that, because he had never done this to be seen. He did it so that Celestia could be seen, even if only in glimpses, even if only in reflection. He once said, "The quietest echoes travel farthest," and so he kept whispering into the world, with stamps, with coins, with words, and with silence too. Sometimes he would simply sit, with the flag beside him, unfurled, unfolded, as if it too needed to breathe. No one visited often, but when they did, they found his home exactly as they imagined. Clean, orderly, filled with papers and symbols, but never cluttered, never chaotic. A space that felt intentional. One guest described it as like stepping into a slowed down version of Earth. Another said it felt like being inside someone's prayer. James didn't comment on that. He just poured tea and asked how their journey had been, because for him, hospitality was also policy. He believed that how we treat one another is how we declare the borders of our inner nations, and his borders were always open. Near the end, his handwriting grew more fragile, but never less precise. His eyes dimmed, but still turned upward every day. He kept the records in good order, kept the stamps in rows, kept the flag clean and pressed, until the last he passed quietly in 1970 without ceremony, without monument, no grand farewell, no state tribute, but those who knew him, those who had received his envelopes or held his strange coins or heard his soft explanations, they remembered, and they told others, and slowly a kind of afterglow formed around his name, a warmth, a gentleness that didn't fade, because what he had offered was never about control. It was about care, and care can linger. Even now, decades later, the idea of Celestia still floats quietly in the minds of those who pause before claiming the sky. It appears in footnotes, in odd histories, in legal discussions about space treaties, but also in poems, in letters and dreams, because James did not leave behind a country. He left behind a gesture, a way of moving through the world with quiet purpose and open hands, a flag not of power but of permission, a symbol that does not demand belief, only presence. And so Celestia remains, not in maps, but in memory, not in systems, but in symbols, not in headlines, but in hearts. Wherever someone stops and looks at the stars and thinks, maybe we should share this instead of taking it, Celestia flickers back into being, and James still walks beside it, still folds the flag, still seals, the letter still offers the coin, one quiet moment at a time. James Thomas Mangan did not see the universe as something outside him. He saw it as something within. To him, space was not just stars and silence. It was a reflection of our inner world. And so Celestia was never just about diplomacy. It was about alignment, an alignment of thought, of rhythm, of energy. He believed that the world begins in the mind, that the great movements of nations begin with small vibrations in the human heart. And he believed that if we wanted peace, we had to think peace before we could ever live it. He called this perfect living, not perfection in action, but in intention, a steady tuning of the self to something softer, something deeper, something unseen. He wrote about it in a book called The Secret of Perfect Living, published in 1952, a quiet book filled with gentle instructions on how to shape your thoughts so that your life might follow. It was not a religious text, nor a self-help commandment. It was a soft companion for those seeking stillness. James believed that words carried energy, that thoughts had frequency, and that repetition could create resonance. He spoke of the mind as a transmitter, and of each person as a signal carrying intention outward into the fabric of the universe. He believed that when we think with clarity, we help bring clarity into the world, and that when we think with fear, we multiply it. So he chose his thoughts carefully. He used affirmations daily like quiet instruments played not for others, but to keep himself in tune. He wrote phrases simple, soft, repeated them aloud, not as magic, but as music. He would say, I am peace, I live in calm, I listen, I offer, I do not need to control. These weren't commands, they were reminders, a way to remember what was already true. Beneath the noise, he believed that thinking clearly was an act of love, that clarity was kindness, and that confusion was not failure, but an invitation to slow down, to breathe, to choose again. And so his philosophy was not about achievement, but about attention. He did not ask people to reach for the stars. He asked them to sit with their breath, with their thoughts, with their longing for something softer. He believed that longing was a map, a way the soul remembers what it came here to find. And Celestia was built from that memory, not from law, not from land, but from longing for peace, longing for honesty, longing for a way to live that felt aligned instead of imposed. He described Celestia as a tuning fork for the human spirit, not a place but a practice, a way to hold your mind, your energy, your presence with quiet dignity. He said Celestia does not begin with papers, it begins in the breath. And so he breathed slowly, fully, deliberately. He believed that the world we create is the echo of the thoughts we allow, and that if we could make our inner sky a little clearer, a little wider, a little more generous, then the stars above might feel more like home and less like conquest. He saw no boundary between the personal and the planetary, between the inner life and the outer action. To him, meditation was diplomacy, kindness was policy, presence was law, and he lived that not loudly, not to teach, not to convert, but to be, because being was enough. He often wrote that we misunderstand power, that we think it is force when it is really focus, that the strongest thing a person can do is choose where to place their attention, and then hold it there, gently, consistently, lovingly. He believed in stillness, not as avoidance, but as clarity. He believed in silence, not as absence, but as preparation. He believed in waiting, not as hesitation, but as respect. And these beliefs shaped Celestia into something strange and beautiful, a nation not of rules, but of rhythm, not of control, but of coherence. He believed that if one person could become fully aligned with peace, with presence, with patient intention, then that person could become a vessel for a better world. That change does not begin in cities, it begins in sentences, in small phrases softly repeated until they reshape the mind, and the reshaped mind reshapes the world. So he spoke gently, he moved gently, he thought gently, and through that gentleness, he built Celestia not just as a vision, but as a vibration. It was real in the way a song is real, not because it can be held, but because it can be heard. And once heard, it stays with you. Even if you forget the notes, you remember how it made you feel. He never shouted his truth. He never sold it. He simply lived it, faithfully, fully, softly. He believed that the great work of the soul was not to be brilliant, but to be balanced, not to win, but to witness, not to command, but to connect. And so Celestia was his way of connecting to others, to silence, to the unknown. He once wrote, "I do not need the universe to answer me. I only need to speak to it with care." And so he did, every day, every word, every thought with care. James Thomas Mangan did not leave behind a country. He left behind a question, a soft question, a quiet offering, not shouted, not carved in stone, but whispered into history. And that whisper has not gone away. It lingers in footnotes, in conversations, in questions asked by those who look at the stars and wonder, who owns this? Who protects this? What kind of world are we sending into space? Celestia was never recognized, not by nations, not by the United Nations, not by treaties or legal bodies, was ignored, dismissed, occasionally mocked, and yet it remains not in borders, not in constitutions, but in minds, in books, in stories told late at night. Because Celestia was never about being official. It was about being essential, a reminder, a mirror, a soft rebellion against forgetting. For years after Mangan's death, his name faded, disappeared from headlines, from archives, from public memory. But it didn't vanish. People found it in quiet ways. A student researching outer space law stumbled across the phrase, "nation of celestial space," and paused. What was that? A flag? A man? A claim? A dream? They looked deeper and found more letters, photos, a flag raised in New York, a passport stamped with stars, a mind thinking gently, and slowly the story returned, not loudly but faithfully. Writers picked it up, philosophers mentioned it, filmmakers touched it, legal scholars nodded to it. Dis reimagined it, not to laugh but to listen, because something in the gesture, something in its purity, in its absurd sincerity refused to disappear. It did not insist, it endured. The United Nations never answered Mangan's letters, but in 1967, it adopted the Outer Space Treaty, a document signed by nearly every major country, declaring that no nation may claim sovereignty over outer space or celestial bodies, that the moon and the planets and the stars must remain the common heritage of all humankind. It was not written because of Celestia, but it echoed her song. The treaty was law, Celestia was poetry, and sometimes they overlap, because even lawmakers are shaped by the stories they grew up with, by the ideas that planted themselves quietly in their imaginations. And Celestia was one of those, a seed planted in the legal soil of space ethics. It said, before we go, let us ask who we are. Before we build, let us decide what we believe. Before we claim, let us remember what cannot be owned. That was James's gift. He left no monuments, no borderlines, no anthems sung in stadiums. He left something smaller but stronger. An image, a gesture, a flag lifted without permission, without force, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful acts are the ones we do without recognition. Celestia lives on in libraries, in legal debates, in speculative fiction, in academic journals, in blog posts, and gentle conversations between curious friends. It lives in classrooms when teachers ask, what if someone claimed the universe? And someone replies, someone did. It lives in children who draw stars and wonder if there's a flag up there. It lives in artists who fold dreams into paper and imagine passports to places that don't exist but should. It lives in quiet people who do kind things without credit, who live as if peace were real because they know that's how it begins. Celestia was never meant to last because it was never about lasting. It was about reminding, and reminders don't fade. They echo James once said, I do not expect my nation to be remembered, but I hope that the reason behind it never disappears. That reason is still here in the slow unfolding of treaties, in the careful planning of space missions, in the growing awareness that outer space must not become just another mirror of Earth's mistakes. His name is not in textbooks, but it's in the space between lines, in the tone of voices when people speak of ethical exploration, of shared sky, of the sacredness of silence. James did not succeed in the way success is measured, but he succeeded in the way meaning is measured. He succeeded because he lived his idea so completely that it could not be erased. He believed in the sovereignty of the imagination, in the power of thought, in the rhythm of care, and that belief was enough, more than enough, because legacies are not made of victories, they are made of echoes, and his is still echoing. So when someone looks up and wonders if space can belong to everyone, they're hearing it. And someone writes without being asked, builds without being rewarded, dreams without being approved, they are continuing it. When someone raises a flag just for the meaning, not the claim, they are living it, because Celestia was never about recognition. It was about resonance. And James, he lives on, not in the stars, but in the space between them, in the stillness, in the possibility, in the pause, before possession or peace waits for someone to speak its name with care.